Hello, Fred Abong here. Welcome to my YouTube channel. Today I'm going to add my 2 cents to what I think is probably a dead topic at this point, so now it's safe for me to get in. Having to do with some arguments, debates about the Vedic astrology system and the use of the Sidereal zodiac versus the tropical zodiac. If you are new to my channel, you won't know this, but if you've watched some of my videos, you know that I use both Western and Vedic astrology in the traditional sense, meaning for the Western stuff I use the tropical zodiac, and I use either an equal house system or the Koch system, house system. And I know other astrologers use a number of different house systems, and that tends to be where the debate in Western astrology takes place. In the Vedic system, I use what is generally accepted as traditional whole sign, equal house with the sidereal zodiac. And I didn't really realize that, I never thought to put the two together, let's put it that way. And I have reasons for that I will explain in this video. But a little bit more background to sort of explain why I use both systems and haven't discarded one in favor of the other. I would go back to when I started learning astrology, which was right around 1999. And I started with the Western system only because that's all that was available at Barnes & Noble at the time. And once I actually I got introduced to Vedic astrology through James Braha, whose book on, I think it was on transits, something, I think it was the one, how to predict your future or something, one of his early Western astrology kind of cookbook texts that I picked up, and it was written from the Western perspective, and I know that he was a Western astrologer as well before he adopted the Vedic system. But I got a reading with him, and it was the first astrology reading I'd ever had. And when I contacted him, he let me know that he doesn't do the Western stuff in his readings. He uses Vedic astrology, which at the time I did not know what that was. But I went ahead anyway because I thought his books were great, and I wanted to have an astrology reading with someone who had a lot of experience. So in any case, he did the reading, and I was pretty impressed with all of his interpretations, especially in terms of timing. And so that really is what put me on the path towards Vedic astrology. But I didn't drop Western astrology. So I started basically studying them in tandem, and this took me basically into 2003 when I finally got certified through ACVA, the American, at that time, Council of Vedic Astrology, and basically preferred for a period the Vedic system and started using that primarily for the readings that I was doing, although I always looked at the Western system. And this I kind of used primarily the Vedic system through, I would say, 2006 or 7, never dropping Western astrology entirely. And then I kind of put all astrology on the back burner because I went back to school to get my master's and doctorate. And that didn't really affect anything in terms of my preference for zodiacs, because in some sense I had not really been paying attention. I would still do readings, but I kind of let it be known that I was in some sense too busy to be doing readings while I was in school. And I at one point even decided that I was done with astrology. And this was right in the thick of when I was, writing a lot and doing my kind of more traditional academic work. And then towards the end of the academic stuff, this would put me roughly in, I would say, around 2012 or 13, the astrological bug kind of crept back up and bit me. And I kind of saw things new, afresh, and started investigating elements of both Vedic and Western astrology that I hadn't previously been interested in. In the Western system, midpoints became very compelling for me. Astrocartography, relocation stuff. So I kind of took up a new course of study in the Western system that was focusing on these other tools. Basically, I was increasing the tools in my toolbox. In the Vedic system, I spent a lot more time on nakshatras, which I had done somewhat previously, but not nearly as intensely as I did when I revisited it or rediscovered my love for Vedic astrology back in around 2011, 2012, 2013, somewhere around there. And during that time of kind of renewing my interest in both forms of astrology, I discovered this controversy about Vedic astrologers. There was a handful of them who were proposing and had switched over entirely to using the tropical zodiac with the Vedic sidereal nakshatras, and were getting reportedly very strong results. And I was kind of excited by that because I don't have a real allegiance to any system, kind of in any theoretical sense or in any kind of loyalty sense. I generally like things that work. So there's a pragmatic approach that I take to both systems of astrology. I tend not to get too tied to or invested in the worldview or lifestyle that can often be packaged with astrological thought of any form. So I was fully on board with investigating this potential crossover between tropical zodiac and the Vedic system and the sidereal nakshatras. And so I ran up against a pretty significant problem immediately, which was that my Vedic astrology software did not allow me to compute the horoscope, the Rashi, with using the tropical zodiac and the sidereal nakshatras. So that took me a while to figure out how to do that. And then once I did that, I actually got kind of immediately saw some things that I thought were pretty cool, that I in some sense I thought helped explain some things about my own chart, which is where I always start when I'm trying a new technique, that I hadn't been able to identify or figure out previously. So I was kind of already starting to slide into this, you could call it a new camp of Vedic astrology. And so I kept trying with not only my chart but with other charts. And after a little bit of time invested in looking at other charts, but always coming back to my own, because I know my chart the best, I know myself the best. And what kind of took the glow off that initial excitement for me with the tropical zodiac sidereal nakshatras was the dasha system. Is kind of the thing that clinched it for me. And perhaps that's kind of arbitrary. Some might say that's an arbitrary way to make a decision about something like this. But I don't really know any other way except for kind of using, because I know there are many dasha systems, and you could say that the Vimshotri system might not be the best thing to use for this new tropical combination. Okay, but and I'd be happy to sort of be shown another a dasha system that really maps on to the what I would call the Neo-Vedic system, and I'm completely open to sort of being shown the light But in my experience, especially again, I'm only focusing, and I will focus in this video on my own chart, because again, I know my chart and I know my dasha system, or I should say I know the periods in my life extremely well. And whereas if I use it on a famous person or even a client, I'm still, in some sense, there's the guesswork involved. And so for my money, the proof of any technique is going to have to sort of reveal itself, not specifically or only in my chart, but it has to at least kind of bear fruit when it comes to my chart. Because if it doesn't, I don't know how I could, get behind it. And so that's what kind of settled the issue for me. Perhaps that's temporary, though. And so my point is here that I'm not interested in getting in any kind of wars about who's right and who's wrong, because I honestly don't care. I'm more interested in becoming a better astrologer by finding better techniques, certainly. And it may just be that I'm a dumbass and I can't figure out the technique. That's definitely a possibility. It may be that I'm doing something wrong, and I'd be utterly grateful if there was something about this Neo-Vedic system that could be demonstrated, using perhaps a couple of example charts by the people who are really good at it and who kind of use it in their practice regularly. So in some sense, I'm offering this video as an example of why I gave up on the technique, which is not to say that why I think it's wrong, because I don't know if it's wrong. I just know that I can't get it to work for me. And in the interest of always becoming better at what I do in terms of astrology, I would put this out there as, an offer for someone to run an example chart of, I don't know if it would work with a celebrity, but someone who's well known, to sort of demonstrate, clearly how the technique works. And I would be grateful for that. I don't really, I don't have an ideological allegiance to the Vedic system or the Western system. I just don't get into ideology generally, and that's my pragmatic bent. So if you've watched any of my videos, you notice that I do use both systems. The last 3 videos I did, I was looking at transits of Saturn and Pluto, which is not a traditional Vedic. They don't traditionally include the outer planets, but as I was saying, I use what works. And I don't know how one could deny that Pluto, Neptune, and Uranus are incredibly important when you're looking at someone's chart. Again, but you can certainly get similar information through other means, and I don't mean to suggest that you have to use them. You don't have to do anything. But for me, again, I'm always kind of interested in finding things that I'm trying to refine my toolbox. And some tools are just useless, or they serve a purpose temporarily and don't need to be kept in the box permanently. And so I'm kind of always trying to figure out how to have the most effective toolbox that isn't overburdened with unnecessary techniques. So with that said, I'm going to, in this video, use my own chart, and I'm going to look at it from both what I'm calling the Neo-Vedic perspective and the traditional Vedic perspective, and not focus too much on personality, because even in the traditional or any kind of astrological interpretation or any astrological system, you can find many ways to determine it or identify a person's personality style. So it would be, I think, it might be interesting, but I don't think it's really going to do what I'm trying to do here. to point out the different personality characteristics that might show up using the tropical, meaning the Neo-Vedic, and the traditional Vedic. But like I said, to me, the dasha systems have a lot of pull when it comes to figuring out which zodiac works. And I don't know, there might be some who would say that that this might not be the best way to go about it, and that's possible. I don't know of any other way to resolve the issue for myself. Like I said, I'm basing this on my own experience and on the chart and person that I know best, which is me, and whose life I know best. So with that said, let's take a look at my Neo-Vedic chart, my traditional Vedic chart, and then the dasha systems that would correspond with each, and see how well they match. Okay, so let's take a look. Okay, so here we have both of my charts from the Vedic perspective. The top one here is the traditional Vedic chart, Sidereal, Sidereal Zodiac, Sidereal Nakshatras. And this is the one I have been using from the get-go, basically. And have had plenty of reasons for sticking with it, and some of those we're going to investigate. Below that is the Neo-Vedic chart. It's not exactly correct because the degree placements are, you'll notice they're all at 15 degrees, and that's because this is basically a teaching example chart, and I can't or haven't been able to figure out how to manipulate the degree placements. But in any case, it's more critical to pay attention to the house placements and the signs of the planets. And so first thing to notice is in my traditional, the one I've been using since I've been doing Vedic astrology, the Virgo rising sign here is now a Libra rising, which isn't a shock to my system because in the Vedic, I should say in the tropical Western system, I have a Libra rising. So this is not something that kind of rocked my world when I saw the shift. So I expected this. Another change between the two is the movement of this conglomeration of planets in my second house, and especially the sign placements, but I'll talk about that in a second. Again, Neptune we're going to ignore here, but Sun, Mercury, these both migrate over to Scorpio, although they stay in the second house. So that's not too big a change. What does change, though, is that Ketu becomes captured, basically, by the first house. So it becomes placed in the first house in the Neo-Vedic chart. And that was one of the things that originally kind of grabbed me, because I thought, yeah, I have a lot of K2 in kind of my makeup. But then you could also argue that that's simply because I have a Sun K2 conjunction very close. So it was interesting, but it wasn't certainly the clincher. Another change that happens is that in the original traditional Vedic chart, I have Saturn here in the 7th house. It stays there. It just migrates over to Aries, which is where it's placed in my Western chart. But Rahu moves from the 8th house into the 7th house. And that was when we get to the dashas, I'll explain why that one is a big kind of decider for me in terms of how that helped me figure out that the Neo-Vedic one wasn't kind of matching up with my experience. So we have a movement of basically the nodes from the 2-8 axis here in this chart into the 1-7 axis in the Neo-Vedic chart. Now again, in my tropical Western chart, I have Ketu or South Node in the 1st house and North Node or Rahu in the 7th house. So in some sense, again, I was open to seeing this play out in the Neo-Vedic chart. A few other things that shift. Venus in this chart, in the traditional chart, is in the 12th house. Stays in the 12th house, but it migrates into a different sign, Virgo, its debilitation sign. And in that same vein, in my traditional chart, the sun is in its debilitation sign, but in the Neo-Vedic chart, it moves into Scorpio. So in some sense, it loses its debilitation status, and Venus becomes debilitated. So that's a big deal. And that should show up somehow in terms of my experience. Not necessarily in terms of personality, but again, because I think you can find ways to explain personality quirks through many avenues if you look for it. But the dasha system, the timing system, I think is an excellent way of determining if these planetary placements, especially by sign, are correct. Also, so I have all these planets here in my traditional Vedic chart. I've got Moon, Jupiter, Venus in the 12th house in Leo, but they're separated. Moon and Jupiter are close to the cusp of Cancer, and Venus is further out towards Leo, which is why we get this Venus here moved into Virgo. But Jupiter also becomes captured by the 12th house in the Neo-Vedic chart, tropical zodiac with sidereal nakshatras. And then we also have the moon staying in Leo, okay, but now it's moved from the 12th into the 11th house. So there's a lot of changes. Oh, and then one more, sorry. There's the Mars here. Mars in the traditional Vedic chart is in the 4th house, which stays the same. 4th house, 4th house. Of course, though, the sign is completely different. Mars moves from Sagittarius here to Capricorn here, so Mars becomes exalted. And again, that was another one that I thought made some sense to me. But again, I have, in the Western system, Mars is in Capricorn, so it wasn't enough to make me completely adopt the new system. So just some things made sense, but I wasn't sure immediately if it was simply because I had been using the tropical zodiac all along anyway, and some of these placements made sense, but they make sense in a different way in the Western chart, and it has more to do with the aspects, the squares, the trines, the sextiles, the quincunxes. So this is the establishing point. There are lots of changes in terms of house placement. The biggest ones being Venus becomes debilitated, the Sun loses its debilitation status, Mars becomes exalted, and the nodes become angular rather than in the 2-8 axis. And then basically my moon escapes the 12th house and moves into the 11th house, which is an improvement. If we were to look at this in terms of who gets better, who gets worse, the moon gets better in this new chart because it gets out of the 12th house, the planet of the mind, the planet of one's kind of sense of security and connectedness becomes less isolated. You become much more invested in groups, networks. Your ambitions are more prominent and perhaps more readily achievable, rather than being hidden away in the 12th house where you have problems kind of flourishing or navigating the material existence, the normal world. So I liked the looks of that. I thought that was like, yes, I'd like to have that change. But Venus, though, becomes debilitated, that's bad, and it's in the 12th house still, which is fine, but 12th house and debilitated is significant. A significant detriment, also the fact that Venus becomes the Lugna Lord in this Neo-Vedic chart, kind of compounds the slide from, you know, a decent, in some sense, decent placement, because there are some texts, and I've seen this work, that Venus is one of the planets that actually does well in the 12th house. And when we get to the dashas, I will explain how that has certainly been the case for me. But Venus in Virgo in the 12th house as the chart ruler would be, generally speaking, I just use plain and simple language, would be, you know, very bad, especially in terms of relationships, especially in terms of health, self-confidence. Although you could make arguments about confidence issues in the original chart, in this new chart, the confidence really becomes massively destroyed, and I just don't think that that's reflects my experience. In any case, so Moon gets good, Venus gets worse, or, you know, super bad, basically. Ignore the conjunction here, because that is not accurate in terms of degrees. But Jupiter, in some sense, kind of stays the same. So this one doesn't really have a significant change. The Sun, though, does become a major shapeshifter here. It moves from its point of debilitation in conjunction with Ketu, which is the way it's placed here. It moves into the sign of Scorpio, so it loses its debilitation status. That's the first thing. And it loses its connection to Ketu, although you could certainly argue that by degree they would still be, you know, connected. By house system, by sign, they are not conjunct. And I find that to be a telling shift that should kind of reflect in my actual experience, especially as it comes to dasha sequences or dasha periods. The last thing is Saturn remains in the 7th house, so that's not a big deal, but it becomes fallen in the new chart. So I have a lot of things that become, in some sense, there's a lot of trading going on here, in terms of signs and planets moving from debilitated to, you know, or decent to debilitated, or vice versa. Again, Saturn becomes debilitated in the 7th house, and although for this new chart, for the Neo-Vedic chart, it's a good planet because it's Raja Yoga Karaka. It rules the 4th and 5th house here, so it's a strong planet, but it's debilitated and it's with Rahu. But they wouldn't be close by degree. This is, again, not correct, the 15-degree combination here. But in any case, the debilitation should show up somehow, especially during the dashas, or even the subdashas, bhuktis and antara dashas. So, and then the last thing, the fact that Mars becomes exalted. So I've got one planet that becomes exalted, Mars, and two planets that become debilitated, Venus and Saturn, and one planet that loses its debilitation status. So those are big shifts. These aren't kind of minuscule, negligible movements. And because of this major change in these planetary placements, especially by Rashi, by sign, it should be obvious during the dashas that shift is recognized and maps onto my reality and my experience. Now, I've been through the Venus star. I've been through Ketu, Venus, Sun, Moon, Mars, and now I am in Rahu. And that's maybe now's a good time to look at the dashas and see exactly how these have played out. So let's do that. All right, so let's take a look at the, I won't go all the way back to the beginning. I want to start with the Venus dasha because it's one of the longest. It's 20 years, and it's one of the planets that undergoes a major transformation in the switch over to the Neo-Vedic system. And that's because it moves from its planetary placement in Leo in the 12th house in the original chart here to its fallen placement in Virgo in the Neo-Vedic chart in the 12th house. So it stays in the 12th house. That remains the same. But it's also the chart ruler in the Neo-Vedic chart and the 8th lord. And it's fallen in the 12th house. Even though it's conjunct Jupiter, it's a wide conjunction. And Jupiter is not necessarily a good planet for this, for Libra rising, because it rules the 3rd and 6th houses. So it's not getting any help, let's put it that way. So kind of an upfront, basic interpretation of this Venus in the 12th house during its dasha, where you would think there'd be a lot of health problems, perhaps, a lot of confidence problems, lots of losses, perhaps lots of debts incurred, a sense of deep isolation, perhaps some problems in relationships, big problems in relationships, not a lot of success with anything artistic because Venus rules the arts and things like music. So when Venus dasha started, I was young, and so I will kind of focus on just a few of the periods because they're the most relevant, I think. And that, I would say, begins kind of around the age of 15, when adolescence hit 82 roughly. And I was in a Venus major dasha and Jupiter subdasha. And I would say, first of all, I began learning to play music. I learned to play guitar sometime around 82 is when I first decided that I wanted to learn an instrument. And in my case, I was lucky enough to have siblings who played. One of my siblings was a classical guitar teacher, so I had ready at hand somebody who could show me the way. And it was around the age of 14. It might have been a little bit earlier. But in any case, it was during the Venus dasha that music had always been important to me since I could remember, at least as a listener. But I took up music as an instrumentalist in this Venus dasha. And when I hit the Venus-Jupiter period, that kind of began one of the, best, most carefree, most fun periods of my, at least of my adolescence, my, late adolescence or early adolescence. This period, Venus-Jupiter, basically the high school years, was when I started a band, hardcore punk band with some friends, and it was just a fantastically fun and carefree time. And that, looking at the Neo-Vedic chart, you would think that that would not be a possibility, especially because it's fallen. This is the thing that's so significant in terms of the change. It's not the 12th house placement, because the 12th house placement is the same in the original chart, but it's the fact that it becomes debilitated. And I honestly, this whole 20 years was, generally speaking, of course there were bumps along the way, but overall the dasha was one of the best that I've ever had. I kind of longed for this dasha because it was so thoroughly pleasant and joyful, which would not be what you would expect given this placement here of Venus in debilitation in the 12th house in the Neo-Vedic chart. I'll go even further and say, so when I hit the Venus-Saturn period, that was a little less completely, I wouldn't say decadent, but fun-filled than the Venus-Jupiter period. This is when I went into college, undergrad, and became a little bit more serious and disciplined and focused. Had a steady girlfriend, this Saturn in the 7th. So it gets Digbala in both charts. Saturn becomes strong in both charts. But in the original chart, in the traditional chart, it's not, it's being afflicted, yes, by Mars for sure. But the same thing is happening here from its 4th aspect. But it's not debilitated. And so this was actually, in terms of relationships, it was a very steady and stable period of relationship. And again, the Venus-Saturn, Venus debilitated, Saturn debilitated during this period. You'd think, if I were, two options. I'd either not have any relationships at all, or if I did, they'd be completely fraught with problems. And that's, it was the exact opposite. Very stable, very kind of steady, not particularly exciting, but certainly not traumatic in any way, not debilitated in any way. The following period, Venus-Mercury, right here, beginning in 1988, June of 1988, and lasting to 1991, well, that was the period when I was asked to join a band that had established itself, and I was asked to join Throwing Muses, who were fellow high school students of mine. They were a year older than I was, but were basically in the market for a bass player, and they found me basically and asked me to join. Okay, so this started my kind of pro music career, although I had been playing music throughout college too, so you know, all along here. So music was in some sense like a real joy, a real success for me during this, you know, especially when I hit Venus Jupiter, but even in Venus Rahu, music was my life basically. And you would not, I think, expect that to be the case. It's not just the debilitated Venus, because you could still say that that would be possible. It's the 12th house. It would be very hidden. It wouldn't be very public. So that's just that. But the Venus-Mercury also, we want to add in the fact that it was Mercury subdasha. And the fact that in this chart, Mercury is the 12th lord and 9th lord, fine. In the 2nd house, which stays the same. And the fact that it's a 9th lord is a blessing for sure. But there's no interaction between Venus and Mercury in this new chart. In the old chart, there's a Rashi aspect. And it's, by degree, it's actually very tight. It's a sextile in the Western system. And it's a mutual aspect between the 9th and 10th lords. And that's basically the period where I had my kind of day in the sun musically with the bands that I was in. And that lasted through the Venus Ketu as well. And again, that shift here puts Ketu in the 1st house rather than the 2nd house. And you'd think that at that point there would be some kind of withdrawal, and it was actually the opposite. And you could say that Ketu is also in a mutual aspect here, a Rashi aspect with Venus. So the main point here is that the Venus Dasha was kind of not just minorly positive, it was a major positive Dasha for me. It was not one of intense pain or any of the things that you would expect with this debilitated Venus in the 12th house. There was a lot of 12th house pleasures going on during that period. And the fact that Venus is with Moon and Jupiter here I definitely felt that reflected in this 20-year dasha, especially during these last, from Venus Jupiter on. So that's one of the things that kind of had me questioning whether or not the Neo-Vedic chart was actually working. And it became even more of a issue when I looked at the following dasha, which is the Sun dasha, which immediately followed. So from 1991 to 1992, basically this year, I transitioned from what was it was a fantastic dasha into the Sun dasha, which in the new chart is not debilitated. It's at the 11th Lord in the second house. That's a yoga for wealth. It is, of course, with the 12th Lord, Mercury, so that might compromise it somewhat. But it's still, not a bad placement. And its ruler in this new chart, Mars, is exalted, which would help it, which would seem to strengthen it. So generally speaking, you would predict some kind of uptick in the finances. Definitely a focus on family. That stays the same because in both charts the Sun is in the 12th house. I'm sorry, the second house. But one thing for sure, you would say that there would be some kind of financial gain, and generally speaking, an improvement in attaining one's aims and goals and desires because it's the 11th Lord. And certainly you would also predict some kind of focus on either money or wealth and family life or domestic life. And that part at least remains consistent between the two charts. So what actually happened? Well, when I hit this period, the beginning of the Sun dasha, I dropped out of the music scene. I quit, basically. And because I wanted to start a family. And I was kind of not psyched about the music industry itself. I thought it was kind of a yucky place. And so I left. Now the family thing you can see from both charts. You can see because we're in the second house. So domestic life became, a primary focus for me. But in this chart, the Sun is debilitated. In this chart, the Sun is not. In this chart, the Sun rules the 12th house. Losses. The Sun is debilitated. Confidence problems. It's conjunct Ketu. More confidence problems. Perhaps a desire to escape. A kind of great confusion. In this chart, none of that. The Sun is strong in some sense. It's not angular, but it's in Mars's sign, and its other sign. The Sun is exalted in Aries, and its ruler is strong here. It's exalted. We don't have the conjunction with Ketu. It rules the 11th house. What actually happened? This whole dasha was probably one of the worst dashas I've ever had. I went from one of the best, Venus, to one of the worst. My confidence completely crumbled. My finances were ever challenging. Actually, the Sun rules the heart. I've had many a panic attack during this period where I thought my heart was, kind of quitting on me. Family problems, all over the place. Problems with government. And because it's the 12th Lord, I also had problems with lots of kind of losses in a number of different ways, which you'd expect from a debilitated Sun in the second house as Lord of the 12th during its dasha. Now, looking at the other chart, you would not expect any of those things. You definitely would expect some focus on domestic situation, as I said. But the money you would think would be improve in some sense, especially because it's the Sun, you put a lot of effort into it and you get the results, especially because it's the Lord of the 11th. Okay, so again, I won't go into every sub-dasha here, but overall, that dasha sucked. I mean, I did have a family, so there were some blessings for sure, but on a kind of psychological identity level, very rough, very rough. And that's, you can see clearly, both you can see clearly from both the Venus and the Sun dasha from this chart and not from this chart. Moving on, we hit the Moon dasha around 1998. Okay, so according to the Neo-Vedic chart, this should be a very positive time. It's the 10th lord in the moon, in the 11th house. So career should become a huge focus. Money, my greatest ambitions, networking, perhaps getting meeting new and famous people or special people of some kind. Relationships with women, perhaps. Although the 11th house might be a bit of a challenge for that, but certainly some focus on women, perhaps with a career. But generally speaking, not a bad placement. It's not in a bad sign. It's in Leo. What actually happened? Well, during this shift between the sun and the moon, I moved into a divorce situation. So the second house stuff kind of crumbled. I had a major loss. I lost my family, basically, at that point. And that would be illustrated by Moon in the 12th. My hopes and dreams were kind of crushed. The Moon is the 11th Lord in the 12th. I kind of lost this idea I had about having a kind of, super strong and super supportive family structure. Gone. I lost the main woman in my life at that point, my wife. So it all happened right here, right as soon as I hit the Moon dasha. Okay, you wouldn't expect that from this chart. But the positive thing that happened was that I became interested in astrology. This is when my interest in astrology actually showed itself, when I hit the Moon dasha, especially in 1999, when I hit Moon Mars. And this is because I became very isolated, I became very inward, became very interested in what I didn't realize was a spiritual path at that time, but that's where I was headed. And the moon, Mars, as a subdasha, it rules the 8th and 3rd houses, and it's in the 4th house here. It's angular. So while I was losing left and right here in the Moon dasha, I was also gaining in terms of my interest and desire to learn about astrology. And that's when it started, this whole first 2 periods of the moon. In this chart, Mars has no connection to the 8th house or spirituality. It's in the 4th. It's, yes, you could say that that's partially it, but not as with the moon being the 10th lord and the 11th house, has no connection to spirituality or astrology or occult studies at all. And this is where it began for me. When I had my, so this Moon Mars period is when I just started dabbling, doing my Barnes and Noble searches. And it wasn't until, though, I had my reading with James Braha, as I mentioned before, which was on the December of 1999. And I was in Moon Rahu when I had that first reading. And Rahu is in the 8th house in my traditional Vedic astrology chart. And that's when I decided I was going to study. So Rahu was clearly connected to astrology. And the moon being in the 12th house, that whole period was when the things kind of clicked for me. In the Neo-Vedic chart, it's just not there. Moon Rahu, no connection to astrology. You could say Rahu is innately connected to foreign ideas, but you'd be kind of stretching it. You'd be making something up. So that, and then when I got a teacher, my first teacher, Gary Gomes, during Moon Jupiter. So you have a guru, and this is in the 12th house. He was a very much a spiritual as well as a Vedic astrology teacher. And then in Moon Saturn, during this Moon Saturn period, I got my certification. So I got kind of credentialed and did gained some authority by getting a credential through ACVA. Moon Mercury, I had my first, and at this point only, article published in the Mountain Astrologer right on April. It was the April-May issue of Mountain Astrologer of 2004. Mercury rules the 10th house in the traditional chart, 1st and 10th. And so I had success through some kind of mystical pursuit, writing, Mercury, communications, in the 2nd house. Of course, it's in the 2nd house here, and you could make the argument that it does rule the 9th and 12th. So that's maybe not as clear, but again, we're looking at the overall picture, which is that the moon is all 12th house stuff. Rahu tripped off this, Mars and Rahu tripped off the Vedic astrology, or the astrology stuff. And kind of overall, I won't go, again, I don't want to go through every sub-dasha, but the moon was where it all began for me. And like I said, you would not show up in the Neo-Vedic chart. At least I don't see how it would show up. Okay. Scoot ahead. I will just briefly mention the Mars Dasha. This is when I went back to school to get my degrees, academic degrees. I finished right around basically 2008. I graduated. I went back and took a couple courses and got my bachelor's degree, and then basically this whole dasha, I went back, or I applied and got into a graduate program and got my master's and doctorate through the whole Mars dasha. Why Mars? Well, in both charts, Mars is in the 4th house, which has to do with getting degrees. It's one of the houses of degrees, and in the original chart, though, it rules the 3rd and the 8th house. And I would suggest that both of those houses, especially the 8th, has to do with research. 3rd house is, I also count that as a house of writing. This is a carryover from my Western astrology practice, not just the 2nd, but the 3rd. So a lot of writing, a lot of research, and a degree here. You put that all together with this Mars as ruler of 3rd and 8th. In the Neo-Vedic chart, you don't get that. You simply get an exalted Mars in the 4th house, which you'd almost think that that's probably better for like real estate or something like that, which, you know, I had no connection to that, homes or real estate or anything like that. Although, as a profession, before I got into school, back into school, I was a carpenter. And that, you could also say, is because of the fact that Saturn and Mars are in angles in both charts. But in any case, I'll bring it up to date here, and this is where, again, things kind of resonate much more clearly with the traditional chart. And that's here. The fact that in 2015 I got into my Rahu Dasha, which is when I got my doctorate in this first leg of it in December of 2015. So I changed dashas. I finished up this period of research and writing and moved into this new dasha. So on this threshold point. But more important than that, most significantly, this is when I set up my website during this period. As soon as Rahu hit, I said, I've got to get my website going. And all throughout here, though, from 2013 on, roughly, I had been working on my dissertation. And part of my dissertation is using Vedic astrology and Western astrology. And I do some case studies in my dissertation using, believe it or not, Donald Trump's chart and Martin Heidegger's charts. So I had come back into my interest in astrology during the Mars Dasha. And again, Mars rules the 8th house in this chart here. rules the 8th, and it has no connection to the 8th house or anything occult really in this chart here. More importantly, Rahu in the original chart is in the 8th house. And if you remember, I mentioned that my first kind of commitment to astrology came in that Moon Rahu period back in 1999 when I had my first reading with James Braha here. And so Rahu periods are major periods of astrology, and every sub-period has been like that as well. Even in 2008, I remember this being a big period, but now I'm in the major dasha of Rahu, and I'm basically haven't been able to think about anything but astrology since I made this transition. And this has led to me putting up my first attempt at a YouTube channel. I've been working on my website a little bit more. And again, you wouldn't see that. You'd see it clearly in this chart. Rahu's in the 8th house here. It is getting an aspect from Jupiter as well, and the Moon, if you count those aspects, or Rahu aspects the Moon, Jupiter aspects Rahu. And so there's a mutual aspect here, and I'm in Rahu Jupiter now. In any case, in this chart, you would not, I'd be hard-pressed to find out how Rahu is connected to astrology, and not simply about relationships or about relationships especially. And that has really not been a focus during this Rahu period. You could say business maybe, getting publicity, things like that. And maybe that's a factor, but I would say that's more from the Bhava chart, which I could show you, and the fact that in the Bhava chart, Rahu moves into my 7th house. But the primary placement here is Rahu in the 8th, and I'm in the dasha of Rahu. Just started in 2015. Like I said, that's when I set up my website, finished up my PhD, and kind of have been studying and practicing astrology much more consistently, with much more interest and energy ever since then. So that kind of brings us up to the present. Again, I don't know if this is the best way to settle the issue on the difference between the Neo-Vedic and the traditional Vedic chart, but because of those shifts of my planets from relatively benign placements to debilitated and vice versa, the dashas just don't match the Neo-Vedic chart. They don't match my experience in the way that they should, and they do match much more cleanly and much more directly in the traditional Vedic chart. So I'm going to leave it there, and if you have any insight or comments about what I might have missed, again, I didn't do a complete analysis because that's not the point. The point is to show how the placements simply don't resonate for my experience. And again, I might be doing something wrong here. I know that I have the placements right for the Neo-Vedic chart, and my dashas, I'm just using traditional Vimshotri. Some people might adjust that a little bit if they use like a 360-day year or something, but basically the dashas are going to be the same if you use the Vimshotri system. So there you have it. I don't have any kind of emotional attachment to my, or an emotional basis to kind of get agitated about the Neo-Vedic chart. If it worked, if it seemed to match my experience, I would have switched in an instant. But as I've just shown, and of course I didn't go into great detail, but the basic picture is that it didn't match up at all with my life experience in terms of the dashas. And for me, that has to make sense, because again, basing it on personality, you can find personality things in many different avenues, through many different avenues. I use the Western chart, so I already know that you can use multiple zodiacs to find personality and house placements. So that's not definitive for me. That's not going to decide it. The dashas will do it. And from what I've presented here, again, it's just a snapshot. I hope you see kind of what I've found to be the problem with the Neo-Vedic method. So thanks for watching, and I'd love to hear your feedback on this. All right, have a nice day. Bye.